Hey there. Ready to get a little philosophical? Today we're taking a deep dive into pessimism, but not the, ugh, I spilled my coffee kind of pessimism.
Right, right.
We're talking about pessimism as a worldview, like a whole philosophy.
Yeah, you could almost call it a lens for examining reality, one that really doesn't shy away from the hard stuff.
Okay, I like that. So by the end of this deep dive, what are we hoping our listeners will kind of take away from all of this?
Well, we'll unpack how pessimism goes beyond like fleeting negativity. It's a structured and often surprising way to understand the world.
Okay, so it's not just being a downer. There's more to it.
Definitely.
I'm intrigued. And to do this, we've got a ton of sources. I mean, we've got key figures in the history of pessimism. We've got the core tenets of this whole way of thinking.
Yeah.
We even see how it tops up in art and literature.
Okay.
And this is a pretty big topic.
It is. Buckle up, because by the end of this, you might find yourself seeing the world, and maybe even yourself, a little differently. We're going deep.
All right, I'm ready to dive in. But first, can you just help me clarify something? When we talk about pessimism, are we talking about just feeling pessimistic or are we talking about something more?
Right off the bat, it's super important to distinguish, between feeling pessimistic and embracing philosophical pessimism.
Okay, so one's a mood and one's more like what?
One is a mood, the other is a whole framework for understanding existence.
Gotcha. So it's less about, ugh, I'm having a bad day, and more about, maybe the universe isn't all sunshine and rainbows, right?
Exactly.
So where do we even start with all this? I mean, pessimism as a philosophy, it's got to have some kind of historical background, right? It didn't just appear out of nowhere.
You're absolutely right. At its core, philosophical pessimism kind of grapples with the idea that suffering might just be like fundamental to the human experience. And this isn't some new age concept. Think back to the ancient Greeks.
Okay, ancient Greeks. What do they have to do with all this?
Well, you had Heraclitus way back in the 5th century BC. He saw life as this constant conflict, this constant change.
Interesting. Not exactly a recipe for blissful ignorance, I guess.
Definitely not.
Okay. So we're talking about suffering, and we're seeing that even ancient philosophers were thinking about this stuff. But what else do pessimists like really focus on? What are some of the other big ideas here?
Well, suffering is a big one for sure. Pessimists argue that it's not just random bad luck, right?
Hmm.
It's woven into the fabric of being human. They point to our constant striving,
Striving for what?
our unfulfilled desires, and even when we achieve something, that satisfaction, it doesn't last.
Oh, yeah, I know that feeling. It's like you work so hard to reach a goal, and then you're already on to the next thing, never satisfied.
That's exactly it. It's that classic grass is always greener problem. And Arthur Schopenhauer, he's considered the father of modern pessimism. He had a lot to say about this.
Okay, Schopenhauer, lay it on me. What was his take?
Well, he believed that this striving, this constant chasing after things, was driven by a force he called the will.
The will.
Yeah. He saw it as this blind, insatiable force. Like it just keeps us chasing after things, always wanting more, leading to more and more dissatisfaction, never quite getting there.
That's a pretty bleak way to look at it, but I can see where he's coming from. I mean, we all experience that to some degree, right? That feeling of always wanting more, never quite being content with what we have.
Exactly. It's a pretty fundamental part of the human experience, according to Schopenhauer.
Okay, so that's suffering in the will. But I'm curious about something. Wouldn't even the most pessimistic person agree that things can get better? I mean, there's been so much progress in the world. We have technology, medicine, we're constantly innovating. Surely pessimists wouldn't deny all that, right?
That's a great question. And here's where things get even more interesting. Pessimists aren't necessarily against progress,
Okay, good.
but they tend to be a bit more cautious about its promises.
What do you mean?
Well, they argue that our attempts to solve problems, even our best attempts, can actually backfire or reveal even deeper issues.
Hmm, interesting. So it's not just about being negative, it's about recognizing that progress isn't always a straight line, that there can be unintended consequences.
Precisely. It's like that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Ooh, I like that. Okay, so I'm starting to see how this can get a little thorny, but I have to ask, are pessimists basically like anti-progress? Are they just throwing their hands up and saying, nothing matters, give up?
Not quite. They're more about recognizing the limitations of our attempts to control the world.
Okay, limitations. We're not as in control as we like to think.
Right. And recognizing that there's always the potential for those unintended consequences.
Got it. So give me an example. How does this play out in the real world?
Well, take technology, for example. It's brought us incredible advancements, no doubt about it. But it's
Hmm.
also brought us, social isolation. You've got online harassment, existential threats like AI.
Yeah, it's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Progress in one area can lead to, yeah, setbacks in another. It's
Wow.
complicated.
Exactly. And that's what pessimists are trying to highlight. Hey, they're saying, let's not get too carried away with all this forward march of civilization stuff. Let's be a bit more mindful, you know?
Okay, I'm with you so far.
Yeah.
But are they just talking about this in like a theoretical sense, or does this actually apply to real-world issues?
Oh, it definitely applies to real world issues.
Okay, like what?
Think about current events. The debates around climate change, political polarization, wealth inequality.
Okay, yeah, big issues.
These are all areas where our efforts to solve problems, even well-intentioned efforts, haven't always led to, to clear-cut solutions.
So it's like they're saying, look, the world is a messy place. Humans, despite our big brains, aren't always great at fixing things.
That's a good way to put it.
Maybe we even make things worse sometimes.
Yeah. And that ties into another key aspect of pessimism. They often highlight the fact that we humans aren't as in control as we like to believe.
Okay, so even beyond all the suffering we've been talking about, there's this whole layer of, like, human limitation. Like, we walk around with these grand ideas about what we can achieve, but reality has a way of throwing us a curveball.
Yes, exactly. And pessimists would point to some pretty stark realities that highlight those limits.
Okay, like what?
Well, the inevitability of death, for one, the constant presence of decay and entropy in the universe. Things fall apart.
Yeah, no escaping that.
These are powerful reminders that we're not all powerful.
Okay, this is getting a little heavy, even for me. So if we're constantly striving but limited in what we can achieve, and suffering is just, part of the deal, where does that leave us? Does that mean life is inherently meaningless?
Well, that's where things get even more philosophically complex and where some of the most well-known pessimists really dove in.
Right, I'm ready. Hit me with the hard stuff. Who are these heavy hitters?
Let's start with a name you're probably familiar with, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Nietzsche. Yeah, I've heard of him. But to be honest, I know more about his mustache than his philosophy.
Well, a good place to start understanding his work and how it connects to pessimism is his concept of nihilism. He argued that the traditional values and beliefs that gave meaning to life, religion, morality, societal structures were, losing their power.
Interesting. So basically he was saying that the things people used to rely on for purpose, for meaning, were crumbling. And that could leave this big empty hole in people's lives.
Exactly. He called this the death of God and saw it as leading to, a sense of meaninglessness and despair.
Whoa. Okay, that's a lot to unpack.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see how that connects to pessimism. But wait, wasn't he also the guy who talked about this eternal recurrence thing?
Yes. That's another one of his big ideas. The idea that everything that has happened and will happen will repeat itself infinitely.
Wait, so like a cosmic Groundhog Day?
Kind of.
Okay, that's terrifying.
It's definitely a provocative concept.
I mean, if everything just keeps happening over and over again, what's the point of anything? Where's the meaning in that?
That's the question Nietzsche wants us to wrestle with. He used this idea of eternal recurrence to challenge people to live in a way that they could embrace, even if they had to repeat it forever.
Okay, so even within this realm of pessimism, there are different flavors, different ways of responding to this idea that life might not have a preordained purpose. It's fascinating, but man, it's heavy stuff.
It is, but I think it's important to grapple with these big questions, and that's what we're here to do, right? To explore these ideas and see what insights they might offer.
Right. And so far, it's definitely been thought-provoking, to say the least. But you know what I'm curious about now? How does all of this translate into actually living in the world?
That's a great question, and one that we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I think I need a minute to decompress after all that existential weightiness from the last part. But, I'm ready for more. We explored the history of pessimism. We delved into these really heavy ideas about suffering and the meaning of life. But now I'm curious about the practical side of all this. Like if someone listens to this and they think, okay, maybe these pessimists have a point, how does that actually play out in their life?
That's a really crucial question because, philosophical concepts can be fascinating, but it's how they shape our actions and choices that really matters.
Exactly. Like, I'm not going to suddenly become a hermit and wear like sackcloth just because Schopenhauer had some gloomy thoughts about the universe.
Yo, haha, I don't think anyone is suggesting that. Pessimism isn't about, dictating a specific lifestyle or anything. It's more like a mental tool.
Okay, a mental tool. I like
A
that.
way of approaching life that might influence your decisions, but it doesn't have to, completely overhaul your personality or anything.
Okay, so it's less about being a pessimist and more about thinking pessimistically, like incorporating that perspective into how I see the world.
Exactly. It's about adding that pessimistic lens to your toolkit. Not necessarily wearing it all the time, but having it available when you need it.
Okay, I can get behind that. But give me some concrete examples. What does that actually look like? How does someone, think pessimistically in a way that's actually helpful?
Well, one practical application is in decision making. So instead of, blindly assuming that everything will just work out,
Right.
a pessimistic perspective encourages you to consider potential downsides and plan accordingly.
So instead of like hope for the best, it's more like hope for the best, but also brainstorm 5 ways things could go terribly wrong and what I do about it. I mean, that could be useful. Sounds a bit paranoid, but
It's less about paranoia and more about preparedness.
okay, preparedness.
And that preparedness can be really helpful in dealing with setbacks, which, let's face it, are an inevitable part of life.
Oh, that's a good point. If you've already like mentally prepared for things to go wrong, maybe it stings a little less when they actually do.
Exactly. You're less likely to be completely, thrown off course or fall into despair because you've already kind of accepted that setbacks are, well, they're just part of the journey.
It's like having like an emotional buffer zone around your expectations. You're not like denying the positive, but you're also not blindsided by the negative.
That's a great way to put it.
So it's all about balance.
Yeah, and it also ties back to that idea of recognizing human limitations, right?
Okay, right. We were talking about that earlier.
Pessimism encourages us to be, more forgiving of ourselves and others. We all make mistakes, we all have flaws, and it's about acknowledging that without letting it paralyze us.
So it's like saying, hey, we're all just messy humans trying our best. Let's cut each other some slack.
Precisely. And that kind of acceptance can be surprisingly liberating. It takes the pressure off, the need to be perfect or to control everything.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially in today's world where there's so much pressure to like achieve, to be happy all the time and have it all figured out. Maybe pessimism is less about doom and gloom and more about like a dose of reality.
I think that's a great way to put it.
But okay, so if we accept that reality, then what? What do we do with it? Where do we go from there? What's the point?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And here's another interesting thing about pessimism. It can actually enhance your appreciation for the good things in life.
Wait, really? How does that work? I thought pessimism was all about like focusing on the negative.
Well, yes and no. By acknowledging the potential for loss, for suffering, for things to go wrong, you might actually find yourself savoring the positive moments even more.
It's like you were saying earlier about setbacks. If you're mentally prepared for things to go wrong, maybe the good times shine even brighter by comparison.
Exactly.
So I'm more aware of them when they happen. I don't just let them pass me by.
You become more present, more aware of the preciousness of those moments because you're not taking them for granted.
I like that. This is making me think about those like cheesy motivational posters that say, live each day like it's your last. But instead of it being this like super happy, clappy message with pessimism, it's more like, okay, I realize this good thing might not last forever, so I'm really going to appreciate it while it's here.
That's a really insightful way to connect those ideas.
So I'm not running from reality. I'm leaning into it.
And it leads us to another important aspect of how pessimism can shape our lives, the search for meaning.
Okay, here we go. Back to the big questions. I remember in the last part you mentioned that some pessimists might argue that life itself doesn't like come with a preordained purpose. So if that's the case, how do we find meaning? Do we just make it up?
It's less about making it up and more about creating it. Pessimism doesn't, hand you a set of answers or anything like that.
Right.
But it might free you from the expectation that there is a single right answer.
So instead of trying to find the meaning of life, we're free to define what's meaningful for ourselves.
Precisely. It's about choosing your values, setting your own goals, and finding ways to connect with something larger than yourself.
Okay, that makes sense. But what are some ways to do that? How do I connect with something larger than myself?
Well, it could be through your relationships, your work, your creative passions, your engagement with the world around you. There are so many possibilities.
I see. It's not about finding one big answer. It's about finding lots of little answers, lots of little things that give my life meaning.
Exactly. And that's something that pessimism can help us to see more clearly. It encourages us to look beyond those fleeting satisfactions to find meaning in the everyday, in the small acts of kindness, in the connections we forge with others, in the simple joys of existence.
It's like that saying, stop and smell the roses. But with a pessimistic lens, it becomes more like, hey, I realize those roses will eventually wilt and die, so I'm really going to appreciate their beauty while I can.
I love that analogy.
I'm full of them today.
It highlights the fact that pessimism doesn't have to be about dwelling on the negative. It can be about finding a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of life, even in the midst of its impermanence.
Okay, I'm with you. But, even if I can see the value in thinking pessimistically, it still feels a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, I get that.
Our brains are wired to be optimistic, to hope for the best. How do we even begin to shift that mindset? How do we start thinking like a pessimist?
Well, it's definitely not easy. And it's not about forcing yourself to become a doom and gloom prophet overnight. It's a process. It's about incorporating these ideas gradually, being more mindful of the potential downsides, questioning your assumptions about how the world works.
Okay, so baby steps. What would be a good first step?
Well, you could start by reading some of the philosophers we mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, even Heraclitus, if you're feeling really adventurous.
Okay, homework assigned.
Just get a feel for how they approached these big questions, how they grappled with these ideas.
I'm on it. And I'm guessing there are, more modern writers and thinkers who are exploring pessimism too?
Oh, absolutely. There are plenty of contemporary writers and thinkers who are exploring these ideas in new and interesting ways. It's a philosophy that's constantly evolving, just like the world around us.
So it's not like a set-in-stone dogma. It's more like
No, not at all.
it's a conversation that's still ongoing.
Exactly.
It's a living, breathing philosophy. I like that. I'm starting to think that maybe we all need a little dose of pessimism in our lives, not to make us miserable, but to help us be more grounded, more resilient, more grateful for the good things we do have.
I couldn't agree more. It's about finding that balance, right? Between acknowledging the darkness and still choosing to embrace the light. And it's about remembering that even in the face of uncertainty and suffering, we have the power to choose our response. We can create meaning. We can make a difference in the world, even if it's just a small one.
That's a really powerful thought. It's like, even if we acknowledge the limitations, we still have agency. We still have the ability to choose how we want to live our lives.
Exactly. And maybe that's the most hopeful message of all. Even within a philosophy that's often seen as pessimistic, there's this profound sense of empowerment. It's about recognizing our own power, even amidst the chaos and uncertainty of the world.
Okay, I'm feeling empowered. But now I have another question. We've talked about how this perspective, this pessimistic perspective, plays out on a personal level, but can we zoom out a bit? Are there other areas, maybe on a larger scale, where a pessimistic lens can be useful? I know we talked about technology and progress earlier, but I'm thinking even bigger, like societal level stuff.
Absolutely. And I think one area where pessimism can be especially relevant is in the realm of politics.
Politics?
Right.
That's not the first thing that comes to mind when I think about pessimism.
I know, it might seem a little counterintuitive, but think about it. Politics is often driven by promises of progress, of a better future, right? Candidates make all these grand pronouncements about what they'll achieve if elected.
Oh, yeah, totally. Hope and change, make things great again. All those slogans are designed to make people feel good, to believe that things can get better.
Exactly. But a pessimistic perspective would urge us to be a bit more critical of those promises, to question the assumptions behind them.
Okay, question the assumptions. I like that.
And to consider the potential for those unintended consequences we were talking about earlier.
So it's not about rejecting political engagement altogether.
No, not at all.
It's about having a more realistic understanding of what's possible.
Exactly.
So instead of just blindly believing every campaign promise, we should be asking, okay, that sounds great in theory, but how will this actually work in practice? What are the potential downsides? What could go wrong?
Precisely. And it's also about recognizing the inherent limitations of political systems. No system is perfect.
Right. And even the best intentioned policies can have unforeseen negative outcomes.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Even when people are trying to do the right thing, there's always a chance that things could go sideways.
That's exactly right. And a pessimistic perspective can help us to be more mindful of those potential pitfalls. It encourages us to be more cautious about, those sweeping promises and to focus on incremental progress rather than those grand utopian visions. Okay, so it's not about giving up on politics altogether, but about engaging with it in a more grounded and realistic way.
Yes.
It's about understanding that change is slow, that there will be setbacks, and that even our best efforts might not always lead to the outcomes we desire.
I think that's a really important point. And it speaks to a broader application of pessimism, the idea that we should be skeptical of grand narratives.
And narratives.
Yeah, those simplistic solutions to complex problems.
So basically, don't believe the hype, don't fall for easy answers.
Exactly.
Look for the nuances, the complexities.
Be a critical thinker.
Question your assumptions.
And be humble enough to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, right?
Right.
And that even our best efforts to create a better world can sometimes have, unintended consequences.
This is making me think about how pessimism might actually be a crucial ingredient in effective problem solving.
I think you're really onto something there. If we're too optimistic, too quick to believe that we have all the answers, we might be blind to the potential pitfalls. But a healthy dose of pessimism can help us be more cautious, more thoughtful, and ultimately more effective in addressing the challenges we face.
So it's not about being a pessimist just to be gloomy. It's about using that perspective as a tool for understanding the world and navigating its complexities.
Exactly.
And it's about recognizing that even within a philosophy that's often associated with negativity, there's a profound sense of responsibility, of engagement, and ultimately of hope. Wow, this whole conversation has really shifted my perspective on pessimism. It's not just about being negative or expecting the worst.
Right.
It's about having a realistic understanding of the world, of ourselves, and of the potential for both good and bad.
I'm so glad to hear that. And I think it's important to remember that pessimism, like any philosophy, is a tool, It's up to us to decide how we want to use it to shape our lives and to engage with the world around us.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've gone from ancient Greek philosophers to modern-day political discourse. And I feel like my brain is doing some serious mental gymnastics trying to, absorb all this.
It's definitely a lot to process, and there's still so much more we could explore.
I know, right? We've talked about the philosophical underpinnings of pessimism, its potential benefits, and even how it might manifest in people's lives. But there's one area we haven't really touched on yet. The role of pessimism in art and culture.
That's a great point. And it's an area that's just rich with examples of how pessimism can be a really powerful force for creative expression.
Okay, tell me more.
Yeah.
How does pessimism show up in, art and literature?
Well, think about some of the most enduring works of art and literature throughout history. They often grapple with these themes of suffering, of loss, the futility of human endeavor, the search for meaning in a seemingly meaningless world.
Okay, that makes sense. Like Shakespeare's tragedies, for example. Those aren't exactly lighthearted rom-coms. They explore some really dark stuff. The darkest aspects of human nature, the inevitability of fate, the destructive power of ambition.
Exactly. And those themes, they resonate with us because they tap into something deep and universal about the human experience.
So it's not that people enjoy watching or reading about suffering. It's that there's a recognition, a kind of catharsis in seeing those difficult truths reflected in art.
Precisely. And pessimism, with its focus on the inherent limitations of human existence, on the potential for suffering and loss, it provides a framework for exploring those truths in a way that can be both, profound and unsettling.
So it's by acknowledging the darkness, by confronting those difficult emotions, art can actually help us process them, to make sense of them, and maybe even to find beauty or meaning in them.
That's beautifully put, and it highlights the fact that pessimism, despite its association with negativity, can actually be a source of creative inspiration.
Okay, I'm ready for some concrete examples. What kind of art are we talking about here? Give me the pessimism highlight reel.
Well, in literature, you have authors like Fyodor Dostoevsky, Franz Kafka, Samuel Beckett.
Oh yeah, big names.
All of whom explored themes of alienation, suffering, the search for meaning in a seemingly indifferent world.
I remember reading Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground in college, and it definitely left me feeling a little existentially rattled. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
It's about this isolated, resentful narrator who's grappling with the absurdity of life and the limitations of human reason. It's heavy stuff,
It is, and Kafka's work is full of characters who are, trapped in bureaucratic nightmares, alienated from themselves and from society.
right? Like lost in the system.
Exactly. Think about the metamorphosis, where the protagonist wakes up transformed into a giant insect. It's a powerful metaphor for the dehumanizing aspects of modern life.
Okay, that one's going on my reading list.
It's a good one.
It sounds like it captures that feeling of powerlessness, that sense that we're not always in control of our own lives.
Yes, exactly.
And what about Beckett? What kind of like pessimistic gems did he offer?
Beckett's plays, they often explore the absurdity of human existence and the futility of our attempts to find meaning or connection.
Right, right. I'm seeing a theme here.
His most famous play, Waiting for Godot, features these two characters who are just endlessly waiting for someone who never arrives.
Oh yeah, I've heard that one.
It's a powerful metaphor for the human condition. Our constant waiting, hoping, and ultimately our confrontation with the meaninglessness of existence.
Okay, I'm sensing these are not exactly light beach reads, but I can see how they fit into this exploration of pessimism. It's like by confronting the absurdity of it all, by acknowledging the limits of our knowledge and our control, these writers are actually offering us a deeper understanding of what it means to be human.
That's exactly right. And it's not just about, doom and gloom. There's often this dark humor, a sense of irony that runs through these works. It's like they're saying, okay, life might be absurd, but we might as well laugh at it, right?
I love that. It's like instead of being crushed by the weight of existence, they're finding a way to like dance with it.
Precisely. And that's a really powerful message, I think. It's about finding a way to live with the absurdity, to find moments of joy and connection, even in the midst of all the chaos.
Okay, so we've got the literature covered. What about the like visual arts? How does pessimism show up in like painting, sculpture, photography?
Well, one movement that comes to mind is Expressionism. Think about artists like Edvard Munch. His painting, The Scream, is like a quintessential expression of existential angst.
Oh yeah, I know that one. That's the one with the like distorted figure, hands clasped over its ears, swirling sky. It's definitely not your typical like happy little trees painting.
Not at all. And Expressionism as a whole was about capturing those raw emotions, the anxieties of modern life.
Okay, so they weren't trying to like sugarcoat things.
Not even a little bit. They were trying to show the world as it felt, not necessarily as it looked.
Raw and real.
Exactly. And another art movement that's, closely tied to pessimism is Gothic art.
Oh, interesting.
Think about those towering cathedrals with their gargoyles and grotesques,
Right.
the stained glass windows depicting scenes of suffering and redemption.
Gothic art. Yeah, now that you mention it, those images definitely evoke a sense of like awe and dread. It's like they're reminding us of the power of the unknown, the inevitability of death.
Exactly. And that's a key aspect of pessimism. The recognition of our own mortality, our vulnerability, our place within this larger cosmic order that we can't fully comprehend.
It's humbling, to say the least.
It is.
So it's like instead of trying to hide from those like uncomfortable truths, those artists, those Gothic artists, they're bringing them to the forefront. They're forcing us to confront them. And maybe by doing so, they're helping us to find a way to live with them.
That's a really insightful way to look at it. And it reminds us that art, even when it explores, dark or difficult themes, can be a powerful tool for self-reflection, for processing complex emotions, and for finding meaning in the face of life's challenges.
I'm really starting to see how pessimism, far from being a recipe for despair, can actually be a source of creativity, of beauty, of profound insights into the human condition.
I think that's one of the most important takeaways from our discussion. Pessimism, when approached thoughtfully, can be a catalyst for exploring the full spectrum of human experience, the light and the shadow.
The good and bad, the highs and the lows.
And it's within that exploration, that willingness to confront those difficult truths, that we often find the most profound beauty and meaning.
Okay, I'm convinced. Pessimism is officially on my list of things to explore further. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back something we touched on earlier. The idea that pessimism can be a valuable lens for understanding the complexities of the modern world. We talked about the environment, technology, social issues. But are there other areas where a pessimistic perspective might be particularly insightful? Like, what else can we apply this to?
That's a great question. And it really gets to the heart of how we can apply these philosophical ideas to our current reality. And I think one area where pessimism can be especially relevant is in the realm of
Okay, my brain is definitely full after that last part. I mean, we explored how pessimism isn't just about doom and gloom. It can be this powerful force in art, you know?
Yeah.
It makes us think about, like, the human condition in a whole new light.
Yeah, it's fascinating how artists and writers throughout history have used these pessimistic themes to create works that are both unsettling and profoundly moving.
It's like they're holding up a mirror to our deepest fears and anxieties,
Hmm.
but in a way that's somehow cathartic, even beautiful.
Hmm.
But I'm also realizing that pessimism isn't just a historical phenomenon. It feels incredibly relevant to the world we're living in right now.
You're absolutely right. And one area where I think a pessimistic lens can be particularly insightful is in the realm of the future, specifically how we think about uh, progress and the challenges facing humanity.
Okay, that's interesting. Because usually when we talk about the future, it's all about,
Yeah.
innovation, technological advancements, creating a better world for generations to come, all that good stuff. But I'm guessing pessimists might have a slightly different take on all that.
You could say that. While optimists might see a future filled with, endless possibilities,
Right. Yeah.
pessimists tend to be more cautious, more aware of the potential downsides of progress.
So it's not about rejecting progress altogether. It's about approaching it with like a healthy dose of skepticism.
Exactly. They'd urge us to consider the unintended consequences, the unforeseen challenges that might arise even from our best intentions.
I could see how that could apply to like a lot of current debates, like with artificial intelligence, for example.
Mm.
There's so much like excitement about its potential, but also a lot of concern about, the ethical implications, the possibility of like job displacement, even the existential threat of AI surpassing human intelligence.
That's a perfect example. A pessimistic perspective would encourage us to be more cautious, to think deeply about those potential risks before rushing headlong into a future we don't fully understand.
It's like that saying, look before you leap. But in this case, it's more like think really, really hard before you invent a super intelligent AI that could potentially wipe out humanity.
Right. And it's not just about technology. Think about the environmental crisis. We've made some progress in addressing climate change, but the challenges are immense. The potential consequences, they're dire.
Yeah. A pessimist might say, okay, even if we do everything right, there's still a chance it might not be enough to avert disaster.
Yeah.
It's a sobering thought, but maybe that kind of realism is what we need to spur us to action.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the gravity of the situation without giving in to despair. It's about recognizing that even if we don't have all the answers, we still have a responsibility to do everything we can to mitigate the damage and create a more sustainable future.
So it's not about being a doomsayer. It's about using that awareness of like potential negative outcomes as a motivator for positive change.
Precisely. And I think this applies to, social and political issues as well. We're facing these really complex challenges like inequality, political polarization, global conflict. And a pessimistic lens might make us question the ease with which some people claim to have solutions to these deeply rooted problems.
It's like saying, okay, I applaud your optimism, but let's also be realistic about the complexities, the historical baggage, the entrenched power structures that we're up against.
Exactly. A pessimistic perspective can help us to avoid those simplistic solutions, to be more patient and persistent in our efforts to create a more just and equitable world.
This is really making me think about how we frame our understanding of progress. Maybe instead of focusing on like achieving some perfect utopian future, we should be more focused on mitigating harm,
Yeah.
on making incremental improvements, on learning from our mistakes, and constantly adapting to new challenges.
That's a really insightful way to put it. And I think it speaks to a core tenet of pessimism, the recognition of our own limitations. We're not all powerful, we don't have all the answers, and the future is inherently uncertain.
So instead of trying to control the future, maybe it's more about navigating it with a healthy dose of caution, humility, and a willingness to adapt.
Exactly. And maybe that's the most valuable lesson pessimism has to offer. It's not about predicting doom and gloom. It's about preparing ourselves to face whatever challenges come our way, with open eyes and a resilient spirit.
After spending all this time immersed in like the world of pessimism, I'm actually feeling a strange sense of not optimism exactly, but maybe a kind of grounded hope. It's like by acknowledging the darkness, by accepting the limitations, I feel more empowered to face the future, whatever it may hold.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful way to describe it. Pessimism at its core isn't about despair. It's about this deep engagement with reality, a willingness to confront the difficult truths, and a recognition that even within those truths, there's a potential for growth, for resilience, and for finding meaning and purpose.
Wow, we really went deep on this one. From ancient philosophy to like modern day anxieties about the future, we've covered a lot of ground. And honestly, I'm walking away from this conversation with a whole new perspective on what it means to be a pessimist.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring this often misunderstood philosophy, and I hope our listeners have gained some new insights along the way as well.
Me too. And maybe, just maybe, they'll even find themselves embracing a little bit of that pessimistic wisdom as they navigate the complexities of their own lives.
It might just be the key to finding, a deeper appreciation for the present moment, for the beauty and fragility of life, and for the enduring strength of the human spirit.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of pessimism. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and remember, sometimes the most profound insights come from the darkest corners of our minds.